The torrent of water was relentless. It surged through the streets, swallowing homes, businesses, and lives. In the blink of an eye, the protective barriers, long neglected and inadequate, crumbled under the onslaught.
The flood, a grim specter of climate change, had arrived in Brazil, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Families huddled on rooftops, their belongings swirling in the murky water below. The cries of children pierced the air, a symphony of fear and despair. The immediate impact was catastrophic, but the deeper wounds, the ones that would fester long after the waters receded, were just beginning to surface. The floodwaters exposed more than just physical damage. They laid bare the deep fissures of social inequality that permeated Brazilian society.
The poorest communities, often those of color and marginalized groups, were relegated to living in the most vulnerable areas, those most susceptible to flooding. These areas, often lacking basic infrastructure like proper drainage and sanitation, were transformed into raging torrents swallowing homes and livelihoods.
The contrast was stark, affluent neighborhoods built on higher ground with robust infrastructure remained largely unscathed, while the poorest bore the brunt of the disaster. The flood magnified existing inequalities in access to resources. When disaster struck, those with wealth and connections could access aid, secure temporary housing, and begin the process of rebuilding. The poorest, however, were left to fend for themselves, navigating a bureaucratic labyrinth for meager assistance. The lack of access to healthcare, clean water, and sanitation exacerbated their plight, turning the aftermath of the flood into a breeding ground for disease and despair. The flood, in its cruel indifference, had widened the chasm between the haves and the have-nots, leaving the most vulnerable teetering on the precipice of survival. The floodwaters receded, but the stain of inequality remained, etched into the fabric of Brazilian society. It was a stark reminder that climate change is not a great equalizer, but a magnifier of existing injustices. The poorest, those least responsible for the environmental degradation that fueled the crisis, were the ones left to bear its most devastating consequences. This was not just a failure of infrastructure, but a failure of empathy, a failure to recognize the inherent dignity and rights of every citizen, regardless of their socioeconomic status. The floodwaters eventually retreated, leaving behind a landscape scarred by destruction and despair. Homes reduced to rubble, businesses washed away, and lives irrevocably altered.
But the receding waters did not signal the end of the crisis. They merely unveiled the long-term challenges that lay ahead. The immediate needs for food, water, and shelter were met with an outpouring of support, but the task of rebuilding shattered lives and communities loomed large. The physical scars were evident, but the invisible wounds, the trauma and the loss, ran deep.
The task of rebuilding was daunting, hampered by a lack of resources and political will. The poorest communities, those most affected by the flood, faced the daunting prospect of starting from scratch, often without the financial means or government support to do so. The cycle of poverty, exacerbated by the disaster, tightened its grip, leaving them trapped in a quagmire of despair. The lack of adequate infrastructure, exposed by the flood, remained a persistent challenge, making these communities even more vulnerable to future disasters. The flood had laid bare the fragility of the systems that were meant to protect the most vulnerable. The inadequacy of social safety nets, the lack of investment in resilient infrastructure, and the deep-seated inequalities all contributed to the scale of the disaster and the protracted suffering that followed. The receding waters did not wash away these systemic problems, they merely exposed them, demanding a reckoning, a fundamental shift in priorities to address the root causes of vulnerability. The task ahead was not just about rebuilding homes and businesses, it was about rebuilding trust, rebuilding hope, and rebuilding a society that truly valued the lives of all its citizens. The flood in Brazil was a stark reminder that climate change is no longer a distant threat but a present and brutal reality. The intensification of extreme weather events like floods and droughts is a direct consequence of human activities that have destabilized the planet's climate system.
Deforestation, particularly in the Amazon rainforest, has disrupted natural water cycles, making the region more susceptible to flooding. The relentless pursuit of economic growth, often at the expense of environmental protection, has created a perfect storm for disaster.
The flood served as a tragic manifestation of the interconnectedness of human actions and natural systems. The rampant deforestation, driven by agricultural expansion and resource extraction, had stripped the land of its natural defenses against flooding.
The loss of tree cover, which acts as a natural sponge, absorbing rainfall and regulating water flow, left the land vulnerable to the deluge. The unchecked exploitation of natural resources, fueled by short-sighted policies and corporate greed, had come back to haunt the very communities that depended on these ecosystems for their survival.
The flood was a wake-up call, a desperate plea from nature demanding a change in course. The consequences of neglecting the environment were no longer theoretical. They were playing out in real time, with devastating consequences for human lives and livelihoods. The disaster highlighted the urgent need for a paradigm shift, a move away from extractive practices towards sustainable development models that prioritize the health of ecosystems and the well-being of communities. The time for denial was over. The floodwaters had washed away the illusion of separation between human actions and natural consequences. Amidst the wreckage and despair, the voices of those most affected by the flood rose above the din, carrying stories of resilience, loss, and a desperate hope for change.
"We lost everything," she said, her eyes welling up with tears, "but we are alive, and that is all that matters." Her story, echoed by countless others, painted a poignant picture of human resilience in the face of unimaginable loss.
"We are helping each other, sharing what little we have," he said, his voice filled with determination. "But we need support. We need the government to step up and help us rebuild our community." His words underscored the deep sense of solidarity that emerged in the face of adversity, but also the urgent need for external support to overcome the immense challenges of rebuilding.
The voices from the floodplains were not just tales of loss and despair. They were calls to action, pleas for justice, and demands for a better future. They spoke of the need for investment in resilient infrastructure, for equitable access to resources, and for a fundamental shift in priorities that place the well-being of people and the planet above short-term profits. These voices, often marginalized and ignored, carried the weight of lived experience, offering invaluable insights into the human cost of environmental degradation and the urgent need for change. They were a stark reminder that the fight for climate justice was not just an abstract policy debate, it was a matter of life and death for millions of people around the world. The flood in Brazil, a tragic manifestation of the interconnected crises of climate change and social inequality, demands a concerted and urgent response. We can no longer afford to treat such events as isolated incidents or acts of nature. They are the direct consequences of human actions, of a system that prioritizes profit over people and planet. The time for denial is over. The time for action is now.
We must turn the tide, not just of the floodwaters, but of the systemic injustices that fueled this crisis. The first step is to acknowledge the interconnectedness of the challenges we face. Climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is a social justice issue, a human rights issue, and an economic issue.
The poorest and most marginalized communities bear the brunt of climate impacts, while those most responsible for the crisis often remain insulated from its worst effects. We must break down the silos, understand the interconnected nature of the challenges, and develop integrated solutions that address the root causes of vulnerability. This requires a fundamental shift in priorities, a move away from the extractive, growth-at-all-costs model of development towards a more sustainable and equitable path.
We need to invest in resilient infrastructure, promote sustainable land management practices, and empower local communities to participate in decision-making processes that affect their lives and livelihoods. We need to challenge the power of corporations that prioritize profit over the well-being of people and the planet, and demand accountability from our elected officials.
The task ahead is daunting, but it is not insurmountable. We have the knowledge, the resources, and the technology to avert the worst impacts of climate change and build a more just and sustainable future. What we need now is the political will, the collective action, and the unwavering belief that another world is possible. The flood in Brazil is a wake-up call, a reminder that we are all interconnected and that our actions have consequences. Let us heed this call, turn the tide, and build a future where everyone can thrive in harmony with nature.